Hello everybody. Yes, I'm back in two-wheel rider towers. Oh my god, it's such bad weather, aren't we? It's yesterday, the day before, it was we've had a bit of sun. And I thought I could get out, and do you know what? I sort of delayed it, and then I thought I was going to get out this afternoon, and it was just shocking. So it's really temperature's really gone down. But anyway, apart from that, welcome back to the Wednesday Bike Club. So today's subject. What I thought we'd look at is the legacy of the Royal Enfield Himalayan 411, because that's such an interesting bike, isn't it? And how that's played out now. And the reason I wanted to talk about it, because come sort of spring, early summer 2026, I'm going to be looking for another. I can't live without an adventure bike. So I thought, I'd look at the Himi 411 because it's such a great little bike, and I thought it would be a nice, cheap, hold that thought, cheap way of getting back into that, and it's something I could use as my everyday hack, because in April I'm going back out to France, and I'm taking the classic 350 out to France, and that's going to live at the house in France, and then I'm going to bring the Enfield Meteor back, and I'm going to sell the Meteor, so that's going to go. I'll keep you posted on that, because it's going to be cheap. But that means I won't have my little hack, which I use my classic 350 for. And I thought, I just like a little adventure bike again, something I can mess around with. And of course, I'm there thinking, I've said this before, that the bike market is so volatile; it changes, every sort of 3 months. And I thought, I could get a Himi, a nice 411 Himi. I love those bikes. I love the dash and everything about those because they're so simple. But I started looking at the prices. And you know what? They're really quite high. So it made me think, what's going on with the Himi 411 then? Because when you look back, I suppose there was this thing about the 411 engine in particular and that Himi, that it really did set the tone, didn't it, for the next couple of 3-4 years. Well, I mean, that came out in 2018, and I remember having in my first Himi. That was a 2018 bike, I think, 18, 19. Yeah. And I loved that bike. It had its limitations. I always thought the engine was a little bit knocky and all the rest of it, because I had it in a scram. But it really hit a real point, didn't it, in time when people were looking for lighter weight, and it wasn't that light, was it? But a sort of lightweight utilitarian motorbike, which anybody could ride, and it wasn't too tall. It was easily accessible. You could get all the accessories you wanted from India and all the rest of it. It was it hit the mark right at the right time, didn't it? And I think a lot of people used to criticise that Himi, for not enough power. It was about 25 horsepower, 24 on it, and at the wheel it's nowhere near that. And people always sort of say we want a Himi with a bit more power. So of course it sort of took the market by storm, because a lot of those Himis were around, a great fan base for those. But of course what happened was, it took a while for other companies to catch up, but they saw that the market was starting to need small capacity adventure bikes, and everybody thought, well, we can make something far more advanced than the Himi 411. So we had that need in the marketplace. But of course what happened, and I think this is really interesting to look at this. So the market needed those small capacity, easy to maneuver. We were moving away from these big bikes, the GSs and all the rest of it. That market, and it's continued to shrink, I think, the market in those, because we've now gone on to these sort of rally style bikes, Teneres and things like that. But of course what we had the sort of, at the same time, the march of the Chinese bikes, didn't we? So we had the CF Moto come along, the 450 MT, and everybody thought, wow, that's going to fill the gap. This is fantastic. But what was the problem with that CF Moto? There just wasn't enough of them. They couldn't supply them quick enough, so they sort of fell out of consciousness quite quickly. I think in that first raft of bikes that came in, there was about 6 bikes. A couple of those went out to YouTubers. Well, they bought them. I'm not saying they were given them, but they bought them, and it was a good way for CF Moto to advertise their bikes. And, it sort of worked, but you couldn't get hold of the bikes. So we then had this funny period where we had this little race going on, didn't we? Who was going to bring out the next bike in that lineup? So we then knew that Enfield were going to bring out their revised Himalayan, which they did with the 450. And then we also, at that same time, we had the Triumph come out, the 400X, didn't we? And Triumph sort of beat them to the punch with that. But I think the interesting thing about the Triumph was that it had its own little niche because it was a scrambler rather than an adventure bike. And I think that was a very clever move by Triumph in that respect. But what it did to the Himi, the 450 Himalayan, was that it came out on the coattails of the Triumph, and I think it suffered in that from the sales of that, because the Triumph sold so many. The buying public that might have gone to the Himi went to the Triumph because they got fed up of waiting a little bit. Now, although the Himalayan 450 seemed to be a success, I think the reception of that bike was slightly muted. I think Enfield pushed and pushed and pushed. They put loads of advertising out, didn't they, and all the rest of it to the motorbike buying public. And I think it didn't fall flat. I rode that a couple of times. I really liked that, but I think it was a great bike. But you know what? I think it missed the mark slightly because it wasn't quite as utilitarian. It was a bit too clever for its own good, which might sound a little bit odd. I think the reason the first Himi was so successful was because of that very basic nature of it. Although I think the 450 wasn't that technical, it had the dash and it was a very reliable bike and a really good bike. But I think people still wanted that simplicity. So we then had other manufacturers coming into that market. I mean, we had BMW with their 450 GS. The problem with that is it's a beautiful bike, but it's too expensive for people. It's taken those people out of the market. They're not going to pay that for a bike like this. It's a beautiful bike that it is. We also had things like the KTM brought out there. Was it the new 390 Adventure and stuff like that? Again, great bike, but it suffered a little bit with teething problems being put out into the market with a few software glitches and things like that. And I think that's the thing. And I what was quite noticeable was when and this is where I'm going to link it to BSA, how it all links in between the two. When BSA announced the Thunderbolt, which did come out like a thunderbolt, didn't it? A bolt from the blue. I think people got so excited about it because it was going back to that simplistic route, wasn't it, of a simple, small capacity bike which wasn't going to be expensive, but will do the job. But it had enough slight updates with a bit more power, being water cooled, and quite simple in its design, but some nice design features in it. People thought, well, that's going to be really great. And I think that sort of blends into this thing about why the Himi now that it's gone out of production, the 411, because there were quite a few old stock bikes around, weren't there? New old stock lying around. I think GB Moto sort of cleared those out. And because of that, those bikes are now gone. And what it's doing, it's elevating the price of second-hand bikes. If I show you, I quite often use Superbike Factory as a barometer of prices because they go around and look at all the prices and they adjust what they've got for sale accordingly. And you see the Himis through there. And Superbike Factory prices are good if you buy in cash. I've said that before. You're looking at over £3,000 for those bikes, which is quite surprising, really. About 3,233, when you could go to some of these new dealers and those bikes were not much more than that, brand new. So it shows that there's still a hunger for the 411, because there's nothing that has quite captured that segment of the market like the 411 did. The 450 didn't do that. I think the Triumph put it in a different direction around the Scrambler because the Scrambler market was on the up at the time. So we have this funny thing now where I think people are quite eager to look at the BSA. I think the interesting thing with all these other bikes that have come into the market, they're sort of too much. They put too much tech and stuff in there, and I don't think the market wants it. I don't think that's what people were looking for. They weren't looking for switches and toggles and things and all sorts of things to press and play with. I think they wanted a real utilitarian bike. That's why a lot of these old trail bikes, you know, the old Suzuki DRs and all sort of thing are still popular, and Honda XLs, because they're simple. I think that's what people want. I think if you over egg the pudding, you create more of a problem, and people fall away. They're not interested. I think the bike has to be simple. Now, why have I put in the title, you know, the BSA conundrum or whatever I put in there? And I think the interesting thing with BSA is that I think, unfortunately, I think BSA have, I think they're slightly too damaged. And I don't think people are trusting them too much at the moment. And I think that's a real shame, because we had the problems, and I'm not going to go back up, we had the problems with the goldstar and all the rest of it, but we had the scrambler touted for quite a couple of years at least, and before it got released. And then we had the Bantam that came out. Now, the problem with the Bantam, which I think is a fantastic bike, and I am quite interested in getting one, is that they've had this problem with the Bantam, in that they've had deliveries delayed, and a lot of that is to do with paint, as far as I'm aware. They're struggling to get the paints right, and so they get delayed another month. I think they're still having problems with the yellow and silver. So the colour choices are limited, and if it's a colour you chose but you now can't get it, that puts people off. And we know that negative comment goes a long way, doesn't it? It goes much further than positive comment, and I still think it's a fabulous bike. But I think it's compounding BSA's problems, because what you also had with BSA, the Scrambler, that got delayed for certain reasons. But there are now BSA Scramblers at dealers, but they're already being slightly discounted. I've seen some Scramblers being discounted, ex-demo bikes, with a few £100 off. And I would have thought at the time, because how many Scramblers can there be out there? I didn't think there'd be many. I think it was delayed till December, but there's already bikes in there. A lot of dealers seem to have those bikes ready to go, which makes me think that, well, certainly that the Scrambler, when it did starting to appearing in dealers, it appeared very much under the radar. People hadn't realised it was there, which makes me concerned about that. And because I think it is a good bike, but I think the confidence levels in BSA has been hit. So why is this relevant to the Himi 411? Is that I think if the Thunderbolt comes out, I think BSA might have a real uphill struggle to get people to trust them, to say that the bike is available and all the rest of it. And it's a real shame. I think they might have damaged themselves too much, which is so sad. I hope I'm not right in that. But what I did find interesting about the BSA, and I did a short episode about this a little while ago, that BSA Thunderbolt is based on the Yedis Adventure. Now, the Yedis Adventure is a carbon copy of the Himalayan 411. And I think if they brought it in as the Yedis Adventure, I think it would sell, because it has the Bantam engine in it, although it's slightly reconfigured in its styling and the casings. I think it would work really well, because I think there's a desire for a bike like the Himi 411, and it is a carbon copy. They've just got some tracing paint and put it around it, but they've updated a few bits just to give it that slight upgrade, if you like. It's something that we would have had in the 411 if they upgraded it, because Enfield do make that the Scram 440, but you can't. Companies like Enfield can't go backwards. It just doesn't work. You can't be, well, we'll stop making that one. We'll go back to the old one because everybody loved that. It just wouldn't work, would it? But I think, again, if the 440 Scram came to the UK, I think it would sell. But I think if BSA or Classic Legends, Moto Legends, I can't remember, Classic Legends, Moto Legends, who are part of the BSA group, who own the BSA and Yedis and Jawa and all the rest of it, I think if they brought the Yedis Adventure to the UK, I think it would sell. I think it's a really nice looking bike, and it's essentially the same bike as the Thunderbolt, but just in different, slightly different clothing. So it's interesting, isn't it? And I think there's this fantastic legacy that that Enfield had with that form, and I think it's become a classic. I think it's going to become a real sought after classic going forward, because good ones are getting less and less easy to find, aren't they? Low mileage, good himis. There must be a lot out there, but I think people are keeping hold of them, and I think they're waiting for the prices to go, because I think they are. I think they're a sought after bike, and I got to think, ooh, do I go down that route and find one now? Because I'm going to have to wait a little while. We shall see. There's a fair amount of scrams around. It seems to be sort of lower in price a little bit, but I think as the prices of the himis go up, then the price of the scrams will go up, because people think, well, I'll just alter it and all the rest of it. But I think the big seller of the himi is the dash, and that great utilitarian look. I just think it's a fabulous bike, and you can see why people love them so much. And it's the underdog, and I like the underdog. It's the underdog nature of it, that you can load it up and it still rides. It's one of those bikes that it doesn't matter how much you load it up, it still rides the same. And that's something I noted the other day when I was riding a bike. If a bike rides fantastic when it's bare, that's great. But when you load it up to go on an adventure, it handles like a dog. You don't want that. The Himi never done that. It always handled the same whether you loaded it up or not. So yeah, that's why I've linked it to the BSA. I think the Thunderbolt looks great, but I'm now concerned whether BSA, with their problems they've had in supply, although I think apparently the supply of the Bantam is now starting to come on song, but have people already linked it to previous problems, and then they're saying, no, we're not. I don't trust it, and that's a real shame. But hopefully they'll overcome that. How many times have I said that now? I feel like I've said that, but we shall see. We shall see. But I think the Himi 411 is going to become a future classic. I really do. A bit like all the J series engine bikes. The classic 350 and the Hunter. I think they will become real classics. I think it's a great platform, and I think that old 411 was a great platform. Right, thanks for watching. I don't know if that's rattled on a little bit too long, but boy, it is cold in here, and my hands are freezing. And I've had my cup of tea, so that's not so good, is it? Right, thanks for watching. Please ride safe. I think it's going to get colder and colder, and I think we might even have a bit of snow. But hey ho. Right, look after yourselves, and I will see you next time. Take care.